The morning I finally saw her, I had been walking past her for 2 years. That is the thing I cannot forgive myself, not that I was cold, not that I was proud, but that I was simply absent. A king can be present in every room and still see nothing. I had become very good at that. Ashkeep Hold in the month of Eldon is not a warm place. The stone walls sweat in the mornings, and the heather on the hills outside goes the color of old rust, and the wind finds every crack in the mortar and reminds you it is there. My people learn to dress in layers, and to keep the hearths fed, and to be grateful for whatever warmth the hold manages to hold inside its bones. I had ruled Ashkeep for 11 years. I had been its alpha king, its lord and its law and its last word on everything, for all of those years except the first, when my father still breathed. I knew every corner of this hold. I knew the names of my warriors and my healers and my trackers and my stewards. I knew which stones in the outer wall needed repointing before the first snow. I knew the height of the river at flood and the weight of the grain stores in lean years. I knew my hold the way a man knows a place he has lived in long enough to stop noticing it. I had not known her name. She had worked in Ashkeep's kitchens for 2 years. The head steward, Orvin, had engaged her himself, a woman from the outer settlement of Pell's Crossing, where the heather fields gave way to scrubland and the packs were loose and unranked and people got by on quiet competence rather than bloodline. She had no rank. She had no mate bond on record, no pack name of significance, no title, no history that made her remarkable by any measure the council used. She set fires. She needed bread. She filled the warming trays before the morning meal and cleared them after and then moved on to the next task and the next. She hummed while she worked, low and even, the kind of humming that does not demand to be heard, but simply fills the air around it. I had not heard it in 2 years, not once. The morning I finally did, it was because my daughter had stopped screaming. Wren was 4 years old and had not spoken in 3 years. She had spoken before. She had, in fact, been a child of considerable opinion, a small person who announced everything she noticed and asked questions in long strings without waiting for the answers. She had said Papa and Wolf and Warm and the sky is doing something. She had said those things to her mother. Then her mother had stopped breathing on a cold morning in the month of Shorn, when the fever that had moved through Ashkeep took Lyra before any of us understood how close it had come, and Wren had not spoken since. She had not stopped hearing. The healers were careful to establish that in the early months when I was still certain it was something I could fix. Wren heard everything. She simply chose to give none of it back. She also chose not to be near people, which combined with the silence made her a puzzle that strangers found either heartbreaking or unnerving. She would scream if someone she did not know came too close, a sharp, furious sound, nothing of grief in it, only pure refusal. The council's wives had tried. The healer's apprentices had tried. A woman my council had nominated, the previous spring, as a possible new Luna for Ashkeep, a composed and capable woman from the Drenmark pack, had crossed the hold's inner courtyard toward Wren on a bright afternoon and gotten 3 steps away before Wren's scream sent the ravens from the tower roof. The woman had been kind about it. She had simply said, quietly, that she did not think Ashkeep was the right match after all, and she had ridden out the following morning, and my council had exchanged the careful looks they thought I could not see, and I had said nothing because there was nothing to say. My daughter had chosen silence. I was beginning to understand that she was perhaps wiser than the rest of us. On the morning I finally heard the humming, I had risen before the hold woke and walked the inner corridor toward my study as I always did, not because I needed to review anything in particular, but because movement helped in the early mornings, before the day filled up with things that required my face to be composed. The corridor ran past the back of the main hearth room, where the kitchen passage led out through a wooden door that was always kept ajar so the warmth could reach the stone hall. The humming was coming through the gap. I stopped because Wren was standing at the door. She was in her sleeping clothes still, her feet bare on the cold stone, and she was facing the gap in the door, and she was still. Not rigid, not trembling, not coiled toward a scream. Still the way a person is when they have found something, and are afraid that if they move it will go away. I had not seen my daughter still in 3 years. She was always moving, always turning, always searching the rooms of this hold with her enormous dark eyes for something she could not find and never finding it. But she was still now. I did not move. I stood at the edge of the corridor and I watched my daughter listen. The humming continued. It was a simple thing, a few notes in a pattern that looped and returned on itself, and it took me a long moment to understand why it felt familiar. Then it opened in my chest like a door. It was the song Lyra had hummed. Not a song with words, just the melody Lyra had carried in the back of her throat while she worked, while she nursed Ren, while she sat by the fire in the evenings. A fragment of something, probably half-remembered from her own childhood, never finished. Ren had grown up with it the way a child grows up with the smell of the hearth, not noticing it because it was simply always there. I had not heard it since the morning Lyra died. I stood in the corridor and did not breathe, and my daughter stood at the door and listened, and whoever was on the other side of that door hummed the song Lyra had carried, and none of us moved for a very long time. Then the humming stopped, and I heard the soft sounds of someone working, the shift of a bread paddle, the settle of the warming trays, and Ren turned from the door and saw me standing in the corridor, and for a moment she looked startled. Then she looked at the door. Then she looked at me again. Her brow made a small, complicated expression that I recognized. It was the expression she made when she had decided something. She turned back toward the corridor and walked to her room. I stood there in the cold passage for a long time after she had gone. That evening I asked Orvin, without explaining why, who worked the morning hearth room. He told me her name was Senna. I did not approach her. I want to be clear about that. I was not, in those first days, doing anything so deliberate as pursuing a course of action. I was a man who had spent 3 years learning to want very little, and I was practiced at containing whatever stirred in me before it became something I would have to answer for. What I did was simply begin to notice. She was not difficult to notice once I had started. She moved through the hold the way water moves through old stone, finding the paths of least resistance, fitting herself into the spaces available, never insisting on more room than she needed. She was not invisible because she was unpleasant or dull. She was invisible because she had made herself easy to overlook, the way someone learns to do when they have spent enough time in places where being noticed was not a thing that ended well for them. She was small-framed and steady-handed, and she wore her dark hair pinned back under a work cloth, and she spoke, when she spoke at all, in a low voice that was precise and meant exactly what it said. She did not fill silence with noise. This was, I was coming to understand, rarer than it should have been. Ren found her the next morning. I did not know at first that this was what was happening. I knew only that Ren, who screamed at strangers and refused every friendly overture from every person in the hold, had not appeared for the morning meal at the table I kept for her in my study. Orvin found her in the hearth room, sitting in the corner on an upturned grain crate, watching a woman knead bread. Not screaming, not turning her face away. Watching. Orvin came to tell me with the particular expression of a man who does not understand what he is seeing, but suspects it is significant. I thanked him and did not go to the hearth room myself. I did not want to disturb whatever was happening by being in it. I asked Orvin to let me know if Ren stayed. She stayed until the bread was done. The woman, Senna, had not, according to Orvin's careful accounting, done anything unusual to encourage her. She had not bent down to Ren's level and used the bright voice people used on children they were trying to win. She had not offered Ren anything or spoken to her directly or made any gesture of the kind that usually sent Ren sideways. She had simply continued kneading the bread and at one point set a small piece of dough on the edge of the table nearest the crate, within Ren's reach, without looking up from her own work. Ren had not taken the dough, but she had looked at it for a long time. The next morning she went back, and the morning after that. By the end of the first week, she was there before Senna arrived, sitting on the crate and waiting. I did not know what to do with this information except carry it carefully, the way you carry something that might be fragile. By the second week, I had adjusted my own mornings so that my walk to the study took me past the hearth room passage. I told myself this was because I was keeping an eye on Ren. I was not entirely wrong. But I was also standing in cold corridors in the early mornings listening to the hum of someone working, and I was not certain that was entirely about my daughter. My wolf had gone very quiet. That was what I noticed most. For 3 years my wolf had been a restless, grieving thing inside me, not feral, not dangerous, but carrying an ache that I had grown to think of as permanent, the way an old injury becomes part of the body's landscape. The ache was simply there. I had stopped expecting it to ease. And then in those mornings in the cold corridor it had gone quiet. Not gone, still present, still mine, but quiet the way an animal goes quiet when it has caught a scent it needs to follow carefully. I did not let myself think about what that meant. On the 12th morning, the door to the hearth room was fully open, and I could see Senna at the work table and Ren at her crate. And Senna had set a small bowl of flour on the table, and Ren had climbed up from the crate to stand beside her. And they were both working the dough, and neither of them was speaking, and the quiet between them was the easiest thing I had seen in 3 years. I stood in the corridor and watched my daughter press her small hands into the dough and feel the resistance of it and try again with more weight. The way Senna was showing her without words, and something moved through me that I had no name for except that it was enormous and warm and made my throat ache. My wolf was not quiet anymore. My wolf had settled. That was the only word I had for it. Settled, the way a river settles after the flood has gone through, the way a room settles after the fire has caught and the warmth is established, and there is nothing left to do but be in it. I stepped back from the door before either of them saw me. That evening, my council convened a meeting about the matter of the Luna selection. I had been avoiding this meeting for the better part of a year. My council was not wrong in principle. Ashkeep needed a Luna, Ren needed a mother, the pack needed the stability of a completed bond at its head. These were not small things. I did not dispute any of them. I had simply not been able to make myself care about the process, which was its own kind of answer, but not one I was ready to give my council. They had, by this meeting, narrowed it to 3 women: Dressa of the Caldenmore pack, who was poised and politically advantageous; Vanna of Highfall, who was kind and well-regarded; and Marit of the Westrun Holds, who was said to be a healer of some skill. All 3 were ranked. All 3 were unmated. All 3 had agreed, through their respective pack contacts, to come to Ashkeep for a fortnight's visit, after which I would choose. I sat at the council table and heard all of this and agreed to set the date. The visit would begin in a fortnight. The 3 women would arrive together, take the guest chambers in the East Wing, and be present at meals and at the Hold's common life so that I could observe them. And Ren could be observed in their presence, though no one in the council said that out loud. I said that was fine. I did not sleep that night. What I thought about was not Dressa or Vanna or Marit, none of whom I had yet met. I thought about a woman in the hearth room whose name I had only learned 2 weeks ago, who hummed a dead woman's melody without knowing what it had meant, and who had given my daughter back something I had not thought she would ever find again. I told myself that what I was feeling was gratitude. It was a reasonable thing to feel. It did not have to mean more than that. I was not very convincing, even to myself. Over the fortnight that followed, I watched Senna the way I had been watching her all along, from a careful distance, without announcing myself, the way a man does when he does not trust himself to be close to something without being changed by it. She did not know I was watching. She was simply herself, steady and quiet and competent, moving through the Hold's rhythms without friction, doing what needed to be done without requiring anyone to thank her for it. She had not been thanked, I was coming to understand, in a long time. Not because anyone was unkind. Orvin respected her work. The kitchen staff worked easily alongside her. But because she had made herself so seamlessly a part of the Hold's functioning that she had become part of the background, like the carved stone or the candle brackets, things you depend on without seeing. But I saw her now. I saw the way she paused when she passed the Hold's old pack wolves in the south yard, 3 aging animals, gray around their muzzles, that most of the staff gave a wide berth because they snapped at strangers. Senna would stop and crouch low and let them come to her if they wanted to, and they always did, pressing their heavy heads against her knee as if she were something they had been waiting for. I saw the way she noticed when the young kitchen lad, Imre, had a bruised hand and quietly added the heavy tasks to her own work without saying anything about it. I saw the way she managed to be wherever Ren was without seeming to follow her, the way water finds the same level without deciding to. And I saw Ren in those days. I saw her opening. It was not a sudden thing. It was the kind of change that happens in a held breath, so slow you almost miss it. Ren began to hand Senna things without being asked: a stirring spoon, the edge of a cloth, a small carved wolf figure she carried everywhere. Not speaking still, but giving things. The healers had told me in the early months after Lyra that Ren's silence was hers to break when she was ready, and that the thing most likely to help her was not pressure but presence, someone consistent, someone safe, someone who simply showed up and stayed. I had tried to be that person. I was, I think, too large for her grief, too much her father and not enough just a person beside her. I carried the loss the same way she did, and we were too much the same shape of loss to help each other out of it. Senna was not carrying it, Senna was simply there. By the end of the first week, Ren was no longer staying on her crate in the corner. She had moved to the table. By the end of the second, she had taken to walking beside Senna on the morning routes, the bread room, the warming pantry, the passage to the great hall, small, shadow-silent, her hand not quite touching Senna's skirt, but close enough that the fabric brushed her fingers. Senna accommodated this without comment, without adjustment, without the kind of careful management that would have made Ren feel managed. I watched all of this and understood, slowly and without wanting to, that what I was feeling had moved a considerable distance past gratitude. My wolf was no longer quiet, my wolf was certain. The bond, the mate bond I had believed I had spent 3 years sealing over, the bond I had thought was Lyra's and gone with her, was not gone. It had not transferred. A mate bond does not work that way. What I had carried for Lyra had been real and was finished and was not something I dishonored by feeling this. But the capacity for it, the part of me that could be chosen and choose back, the part that the moon in its old design had left in me, that was still there. And it had recognized Senna. Not the morning I first heard the humming. Earlier, probably. Long before I had any language for it, my wolf had been watching her, and what I had written off as the general gray numbness of 3 years of grief had partly been something else. The particular restraint of a wolf that is not ready to name what it knows. It was ready now. The problem was that it did not matter, not in any practical sense. Senna had no rank, no pack name of standing, nothing the council would regard as a foundation for a Luna bond at the head of Ashkeep. The council had been clear, not unkind, but clear, about what the hold needed. I had agreed to the selection. 3 women were arriving in 4 days. What I felt in a corridor on cold mornings was not the business of my council, but the choice I made was. I was very practiced at denying myself things. I told myself I would honor the selection. I told myself that Ren's attachment to Senna was a good and healing thing that did not require it to mean more than it did. I told myself that what I felt was real, but that real things could be quietly closed, the way you close a room you do not use, and the world would go on and Ashkeep would go on and Ren would be all right. I told myself these things very carefully over many days, and I very nearly believed them. The 3 women arrived on a gray afternoon in the first cold week of Eldon. They were everything my council had described, composed and capable and appropriate, each in her own way. Dressa moved through Ashkeep with the ease of someone accustomed to being important in rooms. Vanna was warm and made efforts to learn the staff's names. Merritt assessed the hold's medical stores with a healer's eye and offered a quiet opinion about the aging wolves in the south yard that I thought showed good sense. None of them were wrong people. Any of them would have been a reasonable choice on paper for a king who was making his decisions on paper. Ren screamed for all 3 of them. Not the same sharp refusal she gave strangers, this was something closer to distress. She did not understand what these women were for. She only understood that the hold had changed, and that Senna had been very quiet since they arrived, and that something was wrong. I watched my daughter at mealtimes and held my face still, and said the right things to Dressa and Vanna and Merritt, who were being patient and gracious, and I felt the bond in my chest like a stone I was carrying uphill. On the 4th night of the visit, I passed the hearth room corridor, and the door was open, and Senna was alone. The others had gone to their beds, and she was sitting at the work table not doing anything, just sitting. She had her hands flat on the table, and she was looking at the grain of the wood, and the expression on her face was the only time in all my watching that she had looked like something was costing her. I stood at the corridor's edge and watched her face for a long moment. Then I made myself continue to my study. She had not seen me. On the 6th evening of the visit, Orvin came to me after supper with an expression I could not read. He said that Senna had spoken with him that afternoon. She had asked, he said, about the timeline, specifically, about when the new Luna would be established at Ashkeep, and what that would mean for the household arrangements, and whether staff positions would be reviewed. She had asked, essentially, whether she would still have a place in the hold when the new Luna came. I looked at Orvin for a moment. He looked back, keeping his face very correct. I told him to tell her that her position was not at risk regardless of any other arrangements, that her work was valued, and she would always have a place at Ashkeep. Orvin relayed this. He came back and told me she had thanked him and gone back to work. I told myself this was the right outcome. I had reassured her. She would stay, everything was fine. I did not sleep again that night, and in the morning I knew that something in what I had been telling myself had broken beyond repairing. What I did not know, what I had no way to know, was that Senna had gone back to Orvin the following afternoon and revised what she had asked him. She had not, she clarified, been asking about whether she would have a place. She had been thinking of leaving. Not because of her position, because of Ren. She had explained it to Orvin with the same quiet precision she applied to everything. She did not want Ren to become attached to her at the same time as a new Luna was being established. Children, she said, did not always accommodate divided presences easily. If Ren had bonded to her in some way and she had seen signs that suggested this, then her continued presence could complicate Ren's ability to accept whoever became the new Luna. The kind thing, Senna told Orvin, was for her to leave before that attachment deepened. She would go after the selection was complete. She would go quietly. Ren would adjust. Orvin came to tell me this the same evening. I stood in my study for a long time after he left. She was going to leave. She had decided to leave, not because anything had gone wrong for her, not because she was unhappy or mistreated, but because she had looked at my daughter's welfare and concluded, with that same simple precision she brought to everything, that her own absence was the correct answer. She was going to remove herself for Ren's sake. She had not told me. She had not asked me. She had simply decided in her quiet way that this was what was right, and she was going to do it. I sat down at my desk and put my head in my hands for a moment, which was not something I did generally. I was a king. I held my head up. That was rather the point of being a king. I held my head in my hands for a considerable amount of time. Then I went to find Ren. She was in the nursery room with her sleeping cloth pulled to her chin and the small carved wolf on the pillow beside her face, already drowsing. I sat on the edge of her bed and watched her and thought about what I was going to do and whether it was reasonable and whether I cared if it was reasonable. She opened her eyes and looked at me in the half-dark. I said quietly, "I am working something out, little wolf. Give me until morning." She closed her eyes again. She trusted me to work things out. She always had. I had not always deserved it. I had not worked anything out by morning. What I had done by morning was arrived at a truth that I had been avoiding so long that arriving at it felt less like discovery than like finally putting something down. The truth was this. I had not wanted another Luna because I had not been willing to want anything that badly again. I had agreed to the selection because it was the responsible thing, and I had put my face through the motions of it, and my wolf had known from the first day that none of it would hold because none of those women were her. Not because they were wrong, because she was right, because she had been right for 2 years at the edges of my mornings, and I had been too sealed over by loss to see it. I had seen it now. The question was what I was going to do about it, and the answer I had decided somewhere in the small hours was that I was going to tell her. Not through Orvin, not through the council. I was going to find Senna and tell her that she was not going to leave, and that the reason she was not going to leave was because I did not want her to, and that I was aware this was a great deal to say to a person who had not asked me to say any of it. And I was going to say it anyway because I was through, entirely through, with not saying things. I rose before the hold woke and dressed and went downstairs. I did not find her in the hearth room. The bread was already done. She must have come earlier than usual, and the room was warm and empty. I went to the main corridor and then to the warming pantry and then, because I was beginning to feel something close to alarm, to the passage near the small east storeroom where she kept her work supplies. What I found instead was Ren. Ren was in the corridor in her sleeping clothes, her feet bare on the cold stone floor, and she was moving fast for a child her size, with purpose, the way she moved when she had decided something. She did not look at me when I appeared behind her. She was entirely focused on where she was going. I followed her. She led me through the east passage, around the curve toward the old guest preparation rooms, and then to the small chamber at the end of the corridor. A room used for storing mending and linens, the kind of room that had no view and no fire of its own, the kind of room that a woman with no rank and no claims might have been given because it was simply what was available. The door was ajar. Through the door I could see the pale gray light of early morning coming through a high slit window. A small bundle on the narrow bed, half packed. A pair of good boots on the floor, not yet put on. Senna was sitting on the edge of the bed in the gray light, her hands in her lap, and she was looking at the boots. She had not heard us yet. She looked the way she had looked at the work table 4 nights ago, something costing her. Except that now I was close enough to see her face clearly. And what was on it was a woman telling herself to do the right thing and finding it harder than she had expected. Ren pushed the door fully open. Senna looked up. Her eyes went to Ren first, and whatever she had been holding in her face came undone for just a moment, just one unguarded second before she got it back. She said quietly, "Ren, you should be in bed, little one, it's cold." Ren crossed the room in 6 quick steps and put her hand in Senna's hand. Not around it. In it, fingers folding over the palm, the way a small hand fits into a larger one when it means to be kept. The room went completely still. Senna looked down at Ren's hand in hers and did not say anything. Her throat moved. She looked up at the slit of pale window and took a breath, and I could see her preparing to be very kind and very gentle about this, preparing to tell my daughter something that would be the most difficult version of a necessary truth. Then Ren lifted her face. Her eyes were enormous in the gray light, and they were fixed on Senna's face with the full concentrated attention she gave to things she had decided about, and she opened her mouth. "Stay," she said. One word, low and steady and sure, the word of a person who has considered the matter thoroughly. The voice of a child who had not spoken in 3 years, a little hoarse, a little careful, but clear, absolutely clear. Senna made a sound that was not a word. She pressed her free hand over her mouth and turned her face to the window, her shoulders shaking once, then still. I was standing in the doorway. I do not know exactly what I looked like. I know that I was not holding myself in the careful way I usually held myself in. I know that my wolf had stopped being a quiet or a settled thing and had become something wide open, something that could not be closed again, something that did not want to be. Senna turned back from the window. Her eyes were wet. She looked at Ren's face with an expression I recognized because I had seen it on my own face once, years ago, looking at someone I had just understood I could not do without. Then she saw me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The morning light was coming gray and thin through the high window, and Ren was between us with her small hand in Senna's, and the room was very quiet. I came into the room. I did not think about the council or the selection or what any of it looked like. I crossed to where she was sitting on the edge of the bed, and I lowered myself to one knee on the stone floor, not because it was ceremony, because it wasn't. It was simply that I needed to be at her level, to meet her eyes without her having to look up at me, because she had spent 2 years looking up at the world from the edges of it, and I was done being one more high thing she had to look up to. I said, "I heard you were thinking of leaving." She looked at me. Something in her went very careful, the way it always did when she was deciding what was safe to give. "It seemed like the right thing," she said, "for Ren." "Ren disagrees," I said. A breath of something, not quite a laugh, not quite not. "I noticed." I looked at her face in the gray morning light. I had been watching it for weeks from corridors, learning it without meaning to, the particular way the steadiness of it worked, not coldness, not distance, but something earned. A person who had learned to expect very little so that very little could be taken from her. I said, "I would like you to stay, not as a member of the kitchen staff." I paused. I am aware that is a great deal to say to a person who has not asked me to say any of it. I am saying it anyway. She did not look away from me. She was thinking, I could see that, not the performance of thinking, but actually working through something, measuring it. "You have the selection," she said. "You have 3 women who came here for that purpose." "I know. I don't have a pack name, I don't have a rank. The council will have opinions." "I know that too." "Then you know this is not," she stopped. "It is not simple." "No," I agreed. "It is not simple, but I have found recently that the things that matter are rarely simple, and the things that are simple rarely matter." I looked at her for a moment. "I have been very careful for 3 years, Senna. I have been very responsible about not wanting things too much. I am done with that." Her breath came in and out once, steady. In the gray light, her eyes were dark and very direct. Ren, still with her hand in Senna's, leaned her small body against Senna's side and closed her eyes, with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who has decided where she is and considers the matter settled. Senna looked down at her, and then the steadiness in her face did something I had not seen it do. It softened, not into weakness, but into something realer than steadiness, something underneath the steadiness that had been waiting, maybe for a long time, to be seen. She looked back up at me. "I stayed," she said. "Before you asked, I was sitting here telling myself I was going to go and I couldn't." "I know," I said. "How do you know?" "Because you're still here." She looked at me for another moment, then slowly she nodded. It was not a grand thing. There was no ceremony, no hall full of wolves, no cloak placed on her shoulders before an assembled court. There was a gray morning in a small room and my daughter asleep against her side, and the cold stone floor under my knee and her eyes meeting mine with something in them that was going to take the rest of our lives to fully say. That was enough. It was, I was finding, more than enough. I will tell you how the rest of it went, because it did not go easily, and I think it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. I dismissed the selection that morning. I did it personally, went to the East Wing and spoke with Dressa and Vanna and Merritt myself, without sending Orvin, because the least I could do was tell them directly that the selection was concluded, and that I was grateful for their willingness to come, and that they would be treated as honored guests for the remainder of their planned stay if they wished to remain. Dressa took it with composure. Vanna was kind about it and asked if Wren was all right, which I thought showed her quality. Merritt said that she had suspected as much on the second day and wished me well. I had, I thought, been fortunate in the women my council chose. The council itself was another matter. Aldrich, who was my first counselor and had known me since I was a boy and felt this entitled him to say things other counselors were too cautious to say, told me I was making a decision with my wolf and not my head. I told him he was right, and that in this case my wolf had better information than my head had been working with. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said that if I was certain, he would not stand against it. He was not the last, but he was the hardest, and once he had said it, the rest of them found their way to agreement in the following days. There were those in the hold who did not understand at first. Senna herself expected it. She was neither surprised nor wounded by the sideways looks and the careful silences. She had spent a long time being easy to overlook. Being looked at sideways was at least a different experience. She bore it with the same quiet steadiness she brought to everything, and I bore it beside her, and Wren bore it by being entirely indifferent to the opinions of adults about things that had nothing to do with her. The hold learned her name. That was the simplest thing and the one that mattered most in those first weeks. It is a different thing to work alongside someone whose name you know. It is a different thing to greet someone whose name you know. Orvin, who had always known it, made a point of using it in front of everyone, and the kitchen staff followed, and the corridors followed, and one morning I came to the hearth room and heard 3 different people say her name in the space of 5 minutes, and felt something loosen in my chest that I had not known was still tight. She went on being herself through all of it. That was the thing. She did not become different when her circumstances changed. She remained exactly who she was, which was, I was increasingly understanding, the whole point. She had always been worth knowing. The hold had simply not been paying attention. Wren spoke again on the 4th day after the morning in the small room. Not to Senna this time, to me. We were in the kitchen passage, the 3 of us, and Wren wanted the bread paddle and it was too high and she stood looking at it for a moment, and then she turned and said simply, "Papa." I handed her the bread paddle. My throat was doing something that made it difficult to speak. She went back to the table and began working the dough with the methodical seriousness she brought to things she had decided to learn. Senna was watching. When I looked at her, her face had that particular look again, the underneath the steadiness one, the one that was realer than composure. She did not say anything. She did not need to. We had Wren between us and bread dough on the table, and the morning light coming in through the kitchen passage windows, and outside the heather on the hills was going from rust to gold as the season turned, and somewhere in the hold the old wolves in the south yard were moving through their morning routines, and none of it was simple, and all of it was simply ours. I had believed for 3 years that the warmth had gone out of Ashkeep with Lyra. I had believed this the way you believe things you have decided, because deciding them is easier than leaving them open. I had closed room after room in myself, the way you close rooms in a hold you are no longer using, to save the heat for the parts of the building that still needed it. What I had not understood was that you cannot permanently close a room that someone keeps lighting a fire in. Senna had been lighting fires in the mornings for 2 years, in the hearth room, in my daughter, in the corridors where I walked before the hold woke and heard the humming through the door. She had not known she was doing it. She had simply been herself, quietly and consistently in the spaces available to her, and the warmth had moved through the walls the way warmth always does, finding the cracks, following the stone, refusing to be contained. I had thought I was a man who had sealed himself off. It turns out I was only a man who had not been paying attention. She is my Luna now. Not because the council named her, and not because a ceremony made it so, though both of those things happened in time, in their proper order, with Ren standing between us and the old wolves of the South Yard present, because Senna asked for them, and no one felt by then that it was a strange request. She is my Luna because one morning in a cold corridor, I heard someone humming a song I had thought was gone forever, and my daughter stood at the door and listened, and something in me that had been very still for a very long time went still in a different way. The way a room goes still when the warmth has finally reached the farthest corners of it, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Ren says her name every day now, not all of them to Senna directly. Sometimes just to herself, quietly, the way you say a word you are still getting used to owning, like proof that it is real and will not be taken back. Last night she climbed between us at the hearth and fell asleep with her ear against Senna's heartbeat and her small hand in mine. And I sat in the firelight and listened to my daughter breathe and watched the woman who had been there all along, who had simply waited without knowing she was waiting. And I thought about all the mornings I had walked that corridor without stopping. I will not walk past her again,